A very good evening to everyone here and to all joining us online, especially to the IITs joining us today from Bombay, Guwahati, Madras, Delhi, Kanpur, and Hyderabad. A very good evening to you all again. I'm Adarsh, a fourth year undergraduate student at IIC, and on behalf of the IIC Bible Study Forum, I'd like to welcome all of you to the talk. The term resurrection means the coming back to life from the dead in physical form. This idea isn't alien to many cultures. Even the Christian faith is based on the central theme of the resurrection of Jesus. So is the Christian claim just a myth? Or maybe it's a telltale fable propagated by zealous followers? Or maybe the claim is a result of hallucination experiences by Jesus' disciples. But what if it were an event that actually occurred? What kind of historical evidence is there to support it? To address this question, we have today with us Dr. Michael Licona to shed light on the evidences supporting the resurrection of Jesus. Dr. Licona is a Bible scholar and author and is currently an associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University. He is interested in exploring the evidences for Christianity and a number of other major world religions. He has also authored multiple books on the resurrection of Jesus and the historical reliability of the Gospels. He's also a frequent speaker on university campuses and has appeared as a guest on dozens of radio and television programs. Dr. Licona, we are very glad to have you here with us today. Dr. Licona will be addressing us on the topic Resurrection of Jesus Christ, Hoax or History. We will have a Q&A session at the end of the talk. Before we begin, just a small note on the Q&A session. For those of us who are gathered here, you may come up to the mic and address your question to the speaker or write it down on the form provided. Because we have other institutes participating today, we will only be able to accommodate 2 people to come forward to the mic right after the talk. I would also request to either put your phones on mute or turn them off. So now, without much further ado, I would like to invite Dr. Licona for the talk. Over to you, Doctor.
Well, thank you. Good evening, everyone. It is morning over here in the United States still, but so you can tell me what the stock market's going to do today. Actually, I'm very honored to be here. Thank you for inviting me. Well, the resurrection of Jesus is a very important event for anyone and everyone. And I'll tell you why. Let me share my screen here for a moment. Okay, so we have reports of Jesus predicting his death and resurrection, his imminent death and resurrection. So for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 12, verse 40, they had asked Jesus for a sign that he was who he claimed. He was claiming to be God's uniquely divine Son and Messiah. And Jesus responded, well, I'll give you a sign. For just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. And so he's predicting, in a sense, his death and his resurrection 3 days later there. Now, we also have prediction in Mark chapter 8, and verse 31, where he predicts and he says that he is going to be turned over to the Gentiles, the Romans, and they are going to crucify him, but he will rise 3 days later. And then in the Gospel of John, okay, let's see here. Gospel of John, chapter 2, it says, so the Jews said to him, what sign do you show us for doing these things? Sorry about that. Having a little, I don't know what happened. Okay. What sign do you show us for doing these things? Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, "It has taken 46 years to build this temple, and you will raise it up in 3 days." But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So we see Jesus predicting his death and resurrection on numerous occasions in numerous different sources. And what historians do is they look for multiple independent sources. And what we have here is you have Mark, you have Matthew, you have John. I mean, he does it in Luke as well, but scholars do recognize that Matthew and Luke use Mark on various occasions. But what I've tried to do here is taking different scenes where Jesus says this. So we would call that motifs. And so we have it attested in multiple motifs throughout the Gospels. So these are like independent accounts of Jesus predicting his death and resurrection. So if Jesus did not rise from the dead, then it would appear he's a false prophet and had a failed mission. But if he did rise from the dead, then it seems that he did so in confirmation of his personal and radical claims to be God's uniquely divine son. And by the way, he claimed not only that he was God's uniquely divine son, on other occasions he said he's the only son in that sense, and that he is the only way to obtain eternal life. So that means if Jesus is claiming to be the only way, that's tough. I mean, the early Christians were killed for claims like this, because you see, the Romans did not care if you had your own religion. It was a polytheistic society, a pluralistic society. You could have all the different religions you wanted, just as long as the religion of the Roman emperor was one of those. But the Christians came along and they were saying, well, no, Caesar is not divine. No one else is divine. Jesus is the only divine being and is the only way to have eternal life. That's what got the early Christians killed. And it was claims like this that elicited the challenges of his critics to say, well, show us a sign. And so he gave his resurrection as that sign. So again, if he did not rise from the dead, then it seems that he was a false prophet. If he did rise from the dead, then that gives us something we're really going to have to give serious attention to. So the question is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And this is what we want to be looking at here. This is a historical question. So we want to ask what kind of historical evidence might be available for this. So first we start with a very simple point, and that is Jesus's disciples claimed that he had risen from the dead and had appeared to them. We'll just abbreviate that by saying the disciples claimed Jesus appeared. But what I'm really saying by that is his disciples were claiming that he rose from the dead and appeared to them afterward. Now, this is very easy to establish historically. So, for example, you have 1 Corinthians. It's a letter that Paul wrote. And in chapter 15, verse 11, he had just gone through what he called his gospel message, his good news, that Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and appeared to others. And then he says, whether then it was I or the other apostles, this is what we preached, and this is what you believed. So he's saying that the other apostles are proclaiming Jesus' death, burial, resurrection, and resurrection appearances to others. He's doing it, and the apostles are doing it. We also have oral tradition, and that goes way back. So it's a lot like in Hinduism. There's a lot of oral tradition that was passed down through centuries and centuries. My understanding is that, and I heard this from a Hindu scholar at Rutgers University here in the United States, that the message about Krishna, the first mention we have of Krishna in the historical record is an inscription, and it's dated somewhere between the 4th or 5th century BC. Well, if the Bhagavad Gita were true, and there was this big battle back around 3000 BC, Well, the first mention you even have in the historical record of Krishna would be 25 around 2,500 years later. So how was that story passed along? It would have been passed along through oral tradition. Well, we have that in the New Testament as well, but the length of time between the events and when this is being put into writing is far shorter than what we have with the Bhagavad Gita. So you have Jesus dying around the year 30 or 33. And then this oral tradition Paul receives that's put in First Corinthians. And scholars agree that First Corinthians, they can't pinpoint the date, but they think it was written somewhere between the years 53 and 57. So that would mean a minimum that this oral tradition gets put in writing from the time Jesus died, of a minimum of 20 years before it gets put in writing, and it could be as much as 27 years. That's a lot different than 2,500 years. So you have this creed in 1 Corinthians 15. I'll show you that in a moment. And then you have speeches in the book of Acts, Acts chapters 2, 10, 13, and 17. And scholars are pretty much in agreement, even skeptical scholars, that these speeches are sermon summaries that encapsulate what the apostles were preaching at that time. And then we have written traditions. You have your four Gospels in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And then sometime in the first century, scholars have a difficult time dating this. It could be in the late 60s or sometime in the 90s. Again, it's hard to pinpoint it. But a guy named Clement of Rome wrote a letter that has survived. It's called First Clement. And he mentions how Jesus appeared to his disciples after his death. And there's tradition that Clement knew the Apostle Peter, who was one of Jesus' closest disciples. And then there's Polycarp. There's tradition that Polycarp knew and was friends with the Apostle John, another one of Jesus' three closest disciples. We have a letter that Polycarp wrote to the church at Philippi, which, by the way, Philippi was the city that just outside, there was a battle that took place. And this is where the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, who had assassinated Julius Caesar, they were defeated. They and their armies were defeated by the armies of Antony and Octavian. Octavian later became named Augustus, who was the Roman emperor at the time of Jesus's birth. So we have this letter that Polycarp wrote to the church in Philippi, and in that he mentions the resurrection of Jesus. So if Clement and Polycarp knew the apostles Peter and John, that's additional testimony that the disciples were making such claims. So you have this acronym POW or POW in English that informs us that Jesus' disciples were claiming that he rose and had appeared to them. Now, of course, that's not saying that he actually appeared to them or that he actually rose from the dead. It's just the modest claim that they were saying that he rose and had appeared to them. So now this leaves us with two options. And it's very difficult to think of another one. Either he did not appear to them or he actually appeared to them. I can't think of a middle ground here. It's one of these two things. So again, we're not even saying the disciples believed that he had risen and appeared to them. We're only saying they were making a claim that he rose and appeared to them. So he either appeared or he did not appear to them. Let's take the option that he did not appear to them, and let's break that up into two options. They either thought he appeared to them or they did not think he appeared to them. Again, there's no middle ground there. So let's go with a moment to say that they thought he appeared to them. And here we can say there are two more options. Either they were hallucinating or Jesus had an identical twin brother. So let's go with hallucinations for the moment. What are we to say about that? Well, with hallucinations, we learn a number of things in the study of the mental health professions over the last century or so. Hallucinations are falseceptions, false sensory perceptions. So hallucinations can occur in many different modes. So we can have a visual hallucination or an auditory hallucination, or we can have the kind of hallucination that, let's see, let me do this. We can have the kind of hallucination where it's a tactile hallucination. We feel like we're touched, or a kinesthetic hallucination where we feel like we are in motion. Many of us have had dreams that we are falling and then we wake up. Well, that is called a kinesthetic hallucination. You're having a false sensory perception of motion. Or you can have what's called an olfactory hallucination, where you think you're smelling something, but you're not. Or a gustatory hallucination, where you are having the sensation of taste, but you're not really tasting that. So these hallucinations can happen in various different modes. And what science or the mental health profession has found is that hallucinations generally happen in a single mode. So you don't have something where you hear and see something. Now, sometimes this occurs, like if a person is high on drugs or intoxicated with alcohol, or if they're schizophrenics, then in that sense, they can experience hallucinations in multiple modes simultaneously, where they could hear and see something. Otherwise, most people, like if they're grieving over the loss of a loved one, and those are the people most inclined to experience a hallucination, it's only in a single mode. So they may see something, but they don't hear it, or they hear something, but don't see it, or they have the sense of falling, but they don't see something. Hallucinations are these, they're like dreams. So they're going on in the mind of an individual. They're not contagious. So I cannot make another person experience my hallucinations. It's like I cannot make my wife experience and participate in my dream. I could not wake her up and say, honey, I'm having a dream. I'm in Hawaii. Go back to sleep. Join me in my dream. Let's have a free vacation. We won't have to pay for anything. I can't do that. She can't come back and join me in my dream. We might both go back to sleep and dream we're in Hawaii, but we're not having the same dream. And it's the same way with hallucinations. You cannot experience a group hallucination. You can experience a group illusion, like maybe a bunch of people are in a bus and driving down the highway on a sunny day, and they see an illusion, an optical illusion in the road, as though there is water. So you can have a group illusion, but you cannot have a group hallucination. So the problem with the hallucination hypothesis, there's numerous problems. So number one is only 7% on average, only 7% of those who are grieving the loss of a loved one experience a visual hallucination. And yet we have Jesus' disciples claiming that all of them, 100% of them, saw the risen Jesus. We also have group appearances that are reported. So in that oral tradition that I mentioned to you in 1 Corinthians 15, it mentions 3 group appearances: to the 12 disciples, to more than 500 at one time, and to all the apostles. And since group hallucinations are impossible, then group hallucinations do not account for the group appearances of Jesus to others. And then you have the problem of Paul. Now, Paul was an enemy of the Christian church. He was persecuting Christians. He believed that Jesus was a failed Messiah and a false prophet, and he set out to destroy the movement that Jesus had started. And then one day, he has an experience that he believes is an appearance of the risen Jesus to him, and it radically transforms his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. And Paul goes out, he writes about a third of the literature that's in the New Testament. He endures many persecutions, beatings, imprisonments, and he's finally beheaded outside of the city of Rome. And Paul, so Paul testifies that the risen Jesus appeared to him. So he would not have been a good candidate for a hallucination because he wasn't grieving over Jesus' death. He was glad Jesus had died. And so Jesus would have been the last person in the universe that Paul would have expected to see or wanted to see. So the hallucination hypothesis fails. So now let's look at another one, the identical twin hypothesis. Now, this is to say that Jesus was crucified and he was buried, but Jesus had an identical twin who was separated at birth. And when he saw that someone who looked just like him was killed by the Romans, he thought, well, let's capitalize on this and let's say that I'm that Jesus and I've risen from the dead. So that's the identical twin hypothesis. This was put forth by an atheist philosopher named Greg Cavan, probably 30 years ago or more. And it was his doctoral dissertation. And as an atheist, he said Jesus could not have risen from the dead because that would require a divine act. And he says, well, all the other things such as hallucinations and other alternative hypotheses fail. So that only leaves the possibility that Jesus had an identical twin. Now, as far as I know, he's the only one that's ever held that hypothesis. And when I debated him about 10 years ago, right before the debate, he asked me not to mention the identical twin hypothesis because he doesn't hold it any longer. And there's good reasons for it. If any of you are identical twins who are listening or viewing this today, you know that it is easy to fool to deceive your parent or a very close friend, as long as you're not talking or as long as you're not doing much for long. But if that person knows you well or knows your twin well, they know that it's not you after you begin talking for just a little or spending a little time with them. It doesn't take long at all. You can't fool your parents very long. And so in the same way, these disciples had traveled with Jesus for no less than a year and a half and maybe as long as 3 years. And so they had lived with him. They had been with him day and night for all that time. So there's no way that this identical twin is going to be able to deceive them for long. And then you got to ask, why would an identical twin even think about doing such a thing after he had seen Jesus scourged, tortured, and then brutally executed through crucifixion? I mean, if I was an identical twin, I think I'd get out of town lest they think they're going to get his brother. I certainly wouldn't put myself out there and allow myself to get arrested again and put through terrible tortures and a brutal death again. So the identical twin hypothesis doesn't do very well. So the line of thought that says Jesus claimed that he had risen from, his disciples claimed that he had risen from the dead and appeared to them. He didn't appear. They thought he did, but they were hallucinating. That doesn't work. And neither does they thought he appeared because he had an identical twin who tricked them. That doesn't work either. So now we have to look at the possibility that they did not think that he appeared. So they claimed that he appeared. He didn't appear. They didn't even think that he appeared. Well, they either lied or they were using resurrection and the appearances as a metaphor for saying something like Jesus's presence and teachings still seem powerful among us today. So we don't really think that he's alive, but his teachings are still alive. So we're just going to use the metaphor of resurrection to communicate this. So let's just take a moment and look at lied. Well, we have numerous ancient sources that report that these disciples were willing to suffer continuously and even willing to die, many of them brutal deaths, on account of their proclamation about Jesus and that he had risen from the dead and that he was the Son of God. We have numerous sources from the first century even. You have the Apostle Paul, who after converting to Christianity, after he had persecuted the Christians for that time, for at least a year, if not longer, after the crucifixion, and now he becomes the persecuted one. And he says in 1 Corinthians 15 that he and the other disciples lived such a dangerous life preaching the gospel that they could be killed any day. They faced the possibility of death every day. And then you have accounts like in the Gospel of John, which is probably written at the end of the first century, mentioning the martyrdom, the crucifixion of Peter. You have First Clement written by Clement of Rome, and he mentions the martyrdom of Peter and Paul. In the book of Acts, you have the martyrdom of James, the son of Zebedee, who was one of Jesus's disciples, one of the very one of his closest disciples. And you have the persecution of other disciples like Peter, and again, and Paul and others. And this is just from the first century. Then when you get into the second century and third century, you have other sources, and even into the fourth century. Now, not all of those sources are probably, well, it's hard to say that we can trust all of those sources, but the fact, at least there are descriptions of what happened. But the fact that we have so many sources that taught, and even early sources like from the first century, less than a century after Jesus's death, that testify that these disciples were suffering terribly and experiencing great persecution, and even at least some of them experiencing martyrdom, that suggests that these disciples truly believed what they were proclaiming. Now, that doesn't mean what they were proclaiming is true, because we know that people from other worldviews, Hinduism, Islam, Buddhism, even atheists, are often willing to die and suffer for their worldviews. But they're doing so because they believe that worldview is true. And so liars make poor martyrs. The original disciples were not only claiming Jesus rose and had appeared to them, they actually believed it. And today, I don't know of any critical scholars who think that the disciples lied. They were saying that Jesus' disciples truly believed that he rose and had appeared to them. The other option is metaphor here. Again, this can come in several different ways, but one of the most popular is to say that they were using a metaphor of resurrection to say that Jesus' teachings are powerfully alive in the church today. But the problem with such a view is, why would the disciples be willing, all of them, be willing to die for such a thing? And even if they were, what about Paul, who was out persecuting the church? He certainly isn't going to become a Christian because he believes that the resurrection of Jesus, though Jesus is really dead, he likes the metaphor that he rose because people like his teachings. He's not going to fall for that, especially when he thinks Jesus is a false prophet. And then you think about it, the early critics of Christianity, they certainly understood the early Christians to be saying that the resurrection was a historical event. I mean, after all, they came up with explanations such as the disciples stole the body in order to explain an empty tomb. The Christians were saying that he rose from the dead and left behind an empty tomb. And the critics were saying, no, the disciples stole the body. In the early third century, there was a guy named Tertullian who reported that there were people saying that the gardener stole the body, reburied the body, because he was afraid that people coming to venerate the body of Jesus or the tomb of Jesus would trample over his lettuce patch. So he reburied the body. And I just dropped something. I want to make sure it's okay. All right, we're good. Well, yeah, I just disconnected the power. And so the camera is going to be running on battery. I'd like to reconnect it to the power source. So let me do that. Excuse me just a moment. Okay, So you have the critics that are responding by saying that the gardener reburied the body or the disciples stole the body. You have someone in skeptic in the middle of the 2nd century named Celsus, and he said that Jesus faked his death, and when he was in the tomb, they applied some sort of herbs to him and healed him. so so you can see that the skeptics of that day understood the Christians to be saying that the resurrection of Jesus actually occurred. And then the response of the Christians was not to say, well, you don't understand. We're not saying he literally rose from the dead. We're just saying using resurrection as a metaphor. No, his body's still in the grave. We're just using the resurrection as a metaphor to say that his teachings still live on today. So see, what we have as a result, the critics understanding the Christians to be saying Jesus actually rose from the dead, and the response of the Christians to the criticisms of the critics affirming the bodily resurrection of Jesus, this strongly suggests that the resurrection was not merely a metaphor. They meant it to be understood as a historical event. So that doesn't work. So now we're faced with the possibility, we see that the disciples claim that Jesus rose and appeared to them, but that he did not appear to them. None of those options work. So now we have to look at the option that he appeared to them. But we're not home yet, because there's a couple of options. It may be that he didn't die to begin with, and that he showed himself alive afterward. He showed himself alive afterward to others, because maybe they did put some herbs on him. The problem with this is that the rigors of crucifixion and the tortures that preceded it make it very unlikely that a person would survive such an event. Now, I'm aware that there are people in the Philippines that around Easter every year, they allow themselves to be crucified, but it's not by any means the same sense that the Romans crucified people. These people aren't scourged before. Their nails aren't put in the same place. They're allowed to sit in a seat. That's not how crucifixion happened. In antiquity, they would take and they would scourge someone. They would have this whip with bone and metal on the tips, and it would rip the flesh. Josephus said that he saw people scourged, and it would lay their, you could see their bones through it. So, I mean, it would just tear through tissue and muscle where they could see a person's bones. Others report the same kind of thing. Josephus reports that on 2 occasions that a person was whipped to the bone. So we have these reports in antiquity. If you saw Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of the Christ, that's pretty much what scourging looked like. And then they would nail a person to a cross. And what would happen is they'd put nails probably through the wrists rather than the palms. The English translation says the hands, and we think about the palms, but it was most likely through the wrists. The Greek word for hand is cher or cheras, but that can include all the fingertips all the way up to the elbow. So they didn't have a word for just the hand like we do today. So probably through the wrist, and then they would nail the feet, could be through the ankles, or nail through both insteps to the cross. And then what would happen, a person, in order to take because the pain in the feet would be horrendous, they'd want to take the weight off of it, so they'd hang by their 2 the nails through their hands, through their wrists. But if you take your thumb or finger and you put it on your wrist and you push down and you move it around, you'll feel that nerve in there, that tingling. That's called your sensory motor median nerve. And you put the nail through that would be like, you know how sometimes you bump your elbow on something and you get a shot of pain that just goes through your entire arm. Well, that's the same, connected to that same nerve. And so when you put a nail through there, anytime that nail brushes up against that nerve, you get that jolt of pain throughout the entire arm. So that's what a person is hanging by those. And anytime they move a little bit, they get that jolt and pain through their arms. So they're hanging there, but to take the weight off their feet. But in that position, it's very difficult to breathe. It's very shallow breathing because it pulls up against the intercostal muscles. And so you can't remain in that position a long time because of the carbon dioxide buildup. So now you push up against the nail in your feet and pull up against the nails in your hands, exhale, and then go back down. And it's very shallow breathing until you have to push up again. And this is why the ancient reports talk about breaking a crucified person's legs if you had to expedite to death, because they wouldn't be able to push up any longer, and then they would die of too much carbon dioxide, and they'd have seizures and painful seizures and then die. And then once they stop breathing, once they're in that position for say 5 minutes, there's no bringing them back to life. So, and if they didn't break the legs, they would just wait for the person to get so exhausted they could not push up any longer. And then they would have those seizures and then die. So it was a horrible way of dying. In fact, some say that it was the worst way to die in antiquity. So I want you to imagine this. What would a person look like even if they had survived crucifixion? What would they look like shortly after? By the way, there's only 2 accounts in antiquity of someone being removed alive from the cross intentionally. Herodotus in the 5th century BC mentions it, and Josephus mentions it at the end of the 1st century when he says he saw 3 of his friends removed from the cross. As a friend, the Roman commander Titus did it as a favor to Josephus because they were 3 of Josephus's friends. And Titus ordered that the best medical care available at that time be given to them. In spite of that, 2 of the 3 still died. So given the evidence we have for Jesus' death by crucifixion, unless someone can provide good evidence to the contrary, the historian has to conclude that Jesus was crucified and that the process killed him. But then we also have to look at and say, even if Jesus survived crucifixion, what would he look like? Would he be able to convince those to whom he appeared that he had been resurrected in an immortal body? No way. At most, if he could even walk at all, which is doubtful, he would only convince them that he was still alive, and barely so. But they would not think that he had been raised from the dead. So it just doesn't work. And in fact, I could only find a handful of people that had doctorates writing since 1985 who even thinks it's possible that Jesus may have survived his death. And only one of those was a New Testament scholar. The other option is that Jesus' disciples, and this is the final option, they claimed that he rose from the dead and appeared to them. He actually appeared to them, and he died first, and he rose from the dead. That's the only option that really works. And it's the only option that works well in being able to account for the evidence. And I think that this is just very exciting to me, because if this is true, that Jesus actually rose from the dead, and the historical evidence seems to point in this direction, then that means that he is God's only and uniquely divine Son. And his message to us that we can have a relationship with God, that he will forgive us for all our wrongdoings, and that we can have eternal life, a happy eternal life in heaven. That's just really good news. And it means that no matter what bad things we may be experiencing in life, whether we lost a job, or we have a terminal disease, or we have just had a relationship with a wife or a husband or a parent or a child that has just gone bad, and we're not talking to them anymore, or they have left us and we're heartbroken, no matter what the problem is, or it doesn't matter. We know that God loves us, and this life is only temporary, and that God loves us and is going to give us eternal life. That's really good news, and helps us to get through the difficult times in life, and it gives us guidance in what the correct worldview is. So I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope you found it of interest. And so like now, I'd like to just open it up and take some questions from you all.
Okay. Thank you for the talk, Dr. Licona. The floor is now open for questions. Please note that the questions need to pertain to the topic at hand, that is, the resurrection and its historicity. If you wish to ask a question directly to the speaker, please come up to the mic. We can have at most 2 people to come up to the mic. If you wish to remain anonymous, you may write it down on the form provided and hand it over to our volunteers. For those joining us online, please type it in the chat box. Before that, we will first take a question that has already come to us. Dr. Licona, in your opinion, which is the strongest opposing argument regarding the resurrection?
Oh, that's a good question. I don't think there are really good arguments against the resurrection. But if I were going to be a skeptic, I think what I would say is the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus is quite curious. And I don't know how to explain it, but it's not enough to convince me. I think that's the explanation that I would give if I were a skeptic. I just don't find any of the others to be persuasive.
Yeah, thank you, Doctor. Now you may address the speaker.
Hi, doctor. So I just wanted to ask, like, regarding the hallucination theory, or like the basis that we were discussing. So I want to ask, like, I've heard like the use of Amanita muscaria, and it's a mushroom called Amanita muscaria. I'm not sure if you're aware of it, and its relation to Santa Claus. So it resembles the image of Santa Claus that we currently have now. So the basic story goes like, in the northern Europe, the people there were using Amanita muscaria, and it provides hallucinations. And there were also use of reindeers associated with it. Like the reindeers would eat these mushrooms, which are poisonous when they are eaten by human beings. But the urine of these reindeers were drank by the community there, and they used to have hallucinations. And this was a shamanic tradition. So the story goes like that might be a reason for the the Santa Claus story. So I was just asking, like, as an antithesis to the thing, like hallucination, we know that examples of hallucinations had been there in the history. So if some illusions was provided during that scenario, and if the people out there were hallucinated, then shouldn't we reconsider the hallucination hypothesis? That was my question. What was your take on it? Thank you.
Sure, good question. So first I'd say you'd have to show that those kind of mushrooms were available in Jerusalem or in Judea at that time. A second thing is the such hallucinations like that wouldn't account for the conversion of Paul, because Paul was a skeptic, and he's not. So why would he hallucinate the risen Jesus if he's taking these? Even if he gets a hold of these mushrooms, why is it that both skeptic and believer alike are seeing the same Jesus? And the group appearances, remember, you still have problems with group hallucinations. Now, you might have a lot of people in the room eating these mushrooms and experiencing simultaneously hallucinations of Jesus, but they're not experiencing the same hallucinations. And then once they came out of their altered state of consciousness, you got to wonder if they'd be saying, oh man, well, Jesus, that was something. He was over in the corner. No, he was floating up in the seas. No, he was over here doing this, talking to me. And they'd have to recognize that it was a hallucination rather than an actual appearance of Jesus. Is this something they might enjoy the experience, but is it something they're going to be willing to suffer continuously for and die for, because they said the risen Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them? Would this be enough to transform their lives? And then we also have reports, I didn't mention the conversion of James, the brother of Jesus. We know that Jesus had a number of brothers. It's reported in several of the Gospels. And even Josephus reports that Jesus had a brother named James who was martyred. The Gospels report that none of Jesus' brothers were followers of him during his ministry. But then afterward, we find them as believers. They're not even believers at the time of his crucifixion, because Jesus transfers the care of his mother over to his beloved disciple, not to one of his brothers, because he was more concerned about the spiritual well-being of his mother than just only her physical well-being. So, but afterwards, shortly after, we find Jesus' brothers, all believers, and James, his brother, becomes leader in the Jerusalem church and even is killed because he won't deny that his brother is the Messiah. So I would think that if they were just taking these mushrooms to have hallucinatory experiences, altered states of consciousness, they're going to realize that Jesus hasn't actually raised, that it's just a result of the mushrooms. And then if the Gospels are correct, that Jesus was buried in a tomb and that the tomb was found empty later, hallucinations don't explain the empty tomb. Also, if Jesus' appearances were hallucinations, they would probably think more or less that he had been raised spiritually, not physically. But the earliest claims of the Christians is that he rose bodily, physically from the dead. And that just doesn't work well with hallucinations. So you can see, regardless of how those hallucinations happen, the hallucination hypothesis does a terrible job of explaining the appearances in group settings to all the apostles simultaneously, to Paul, to James, the belief in bodily resurrection, the empty tomb. It really doesn't explain much at all.
Thank you, Dr. Licona. Is there somebody else? Okay, we've got another question for Doctor. This is from IIT Hyderabad. What are the reasons for the Jews' unbelief in the resurrection?
Well, I would think that there are a number of reasons. I think probably a main reason that Jews today don't believe in Jesus is many of them are atheists and agnostics. Here in the United States, the majority of Jews living here are atheists. They don't even follow their own Jewish religion. Now, they may follow Jewish traditions, but it's more of a cultural thing rather than they actually believe. So that'd be one reason why today they don't believe. Another reason is, they could use any of the other skeptical arguments, or committed Jews today may not believe because they do not think that Jesus fulfilled the prophecies for their Messiah. Back, I believe it was in the 1980s, there was a Jewish historian named Pinchas Lapid, and he wrote a book about the resurrection, and he concluded that the historical evidence was pretty sound and changed his belief. He came to believe that Jesus rose from the dead. But he said because he didn't think Jesus fulfilled the prophecies to be the Messiah, that therefore Jesus was the savior of the Gentiles, but the Jews still awaited a Messiah. So, so it's a matter of a difference in how Jews and Christians, and many Christians, and we can say the first Christians were Jews. All of Jesus' disciples were Jews. Jesus was a Jew. The apostles, they were all Jews. So they understood messianic prophecies differently than the other Jews did. So I think that's probably a main reason why conservative or very religious Jews do not back then or today accept Jesus as Messiah.
Thank you, Doctor. We've got another question here that says, what about martyrs of other faiths, for example, Islam? If they or their followers were lying, why did they die for their faith?
Right. So with modern Muslims, it'd be the same as Christians and Hindus and Buddhists and people of other faiths. I'm not saying that because they die for their beliefs or suffer for them, that means that those beliefs are true, but it does mean that they sincerely believe they're true. Now, when it comes to, so let's go back to the original Muslims, Muhammad and others. Well, Muhammad didn't die as a martyr. He got sick and died. But his followers, many of those were willing to be martyrs. Many of them were martyred. But here's the difference. They were willing to be martyred or die in battle. Remember, they were the aggressors. So it's not that they were martyred. They just were killed in battle as they were trying to conquer. They died for what they believed is true, but they were going on they were believing Muhammad on it. They didn't see anything themselves because there was no miracles really claimed of Muhammad during his lifetime, at least of which I'm aware. So they are trusting the word of Muhammad that the angel Gabriel was appearing to him in dreams and trances and revealing the Quran to him. And then he'd wake up, come out of the trance, and then tell them what was revealed to him. So they are just taking his word on it. They're not actually experiencing it themselves. The difference is that the apostles, the disciples of Jesus, were claiming that they had actually seen the risen Jesus. And so Muhammad's followers were dying for what they believed was true, but the disciples of Jesus were suffering and dying for what they either knew was true or knew was false. And that's a big difference there, because no one's really claiming they were dying for what they knew was false. That's not the claim today. They were dying for what they believed was true. So now the question is, how did they come to believe that? What were the nature of these experiences they had that they interpreted as an appearance of the risen Jesus? And my contention is the only reasonable explanation is that Jesus rose from the dead and actually appeared to them. But we can come up with all sorts of natural explanations for how Muhammad may have had those experiences in which he claimed the Quran was revealed to him by Gabriel.
Thank you, Dr. Licona. Since there are no more questions from here, we can take questions from other institutes now. First, I would like to invite IIT Bombay. Over to you, IIT Bombay.
We don't have any questions at the moment. Thank you.
Okay, moving on then. We have IIT Madras.
Yeah, thank you, doctor. Let's say Jesus chose the path of reincarnation, like coming again to life in another physical body, and claim I'm Jesus and died and risen again. Can the essence of redemption be still valid?
Okay, so stay there. So let me. I want to make sure I understand your question. So you're positing, is it possible that Jesus was just another reincarnated being, another being reincarnated, and then he just kind of made this thing up about? Okay, but I'm not like well versed on reincarnation, but let me ask you this, because I know in India reincarnation is a big belief. So would you believe those who hold to reincarnation, would they think that Jesus would die and then immediately someone would come back fully formed as a human, an identical kind of body, and then claim to be that person? I mean, my understanding, at least for reincarnation, at least how people here in the United States believe it, a person dies and then they come back, they're reborn into someone else, so that they become a baby and then they grow up through childhood and become an adult. But it seems to me that the scenario you're positing would require that Jesus dies and then the person he gets reincarnated back exactly like himself. Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, Yeah, you understood correctly, sir. I mean, in Hindu culture, it's like Brahma taking the path of various reincarnated into another being and then claiming he's the god. So, does the same path that Hindus believe in, does the same path can be possible? Is it possible in this um, resurrection claim?
Yeah, I appreciate the question. That's the first time I've been asked a question like that, and I have to think through it because I guess I'd really have to ponder to see. I want to get a better understanding of the scenario that you're actually positing and how it works. And I suppose I just don't understand reincarnation well enough. But even if the scenario you're positing occurred, wouldn't it mean some sort of a deceit is involved? Because Jesus is claiming that he had been resurrected, not reincarnated. And the belief in resurrection, the concept of resurrection, is that the body dies and then that same body is brought back to life. Reincarnation is like in another body, isn't it?
Yeah, I
Does
mean,
it occur in the same body?
it's unbelievable, isn't it? If somebody claims that, okay, I'm Jesus again in other body. So, I mean,
I'm
nobody
sorry.
will-
Can you speak a little bit more into that? It's kind of hard to hear.
okay. So, if Jesus claims that, okay, I'm Jesus in another body, and it's really unbelievable, isn't it? People won't actually believe it, right?
Yeah, I just I guess I would want to talk with you further and get more clarification on that. It's kind of new to me, and I'm having a little bit of difficulty in comprehending the concept. And when you're speaking, the signal that's coming through isn't really clear. So I'm having some challenges from a couple of different ends here, and I apologize. I wish I could answer a little more clearly, but I appreciate your question.
So moving on now, um, we have a question from, we can have a question from IIT Guwahati. Over to you, IIT Guwahati.
Can you hear us?
Yes.
Yeah, so we know that in Christianity, it is believed that Jesus dying on the cross or the crucifixion is substitution of our punishment. So, but what is the significance or the importance of resurrection? Like,
Okay. Well, that's fair. I'm sure God, if he wanted to, he could have chosen a different mode, but resurrection seems to be the mode he chose. It seems that when that God doesn't want to, he views his creation as good. In fact, in the book of Genesis, it says God looked at it and said, this is it is good. He's pleased with it. So his view is not to destroy, it's to save. And so resurrection is not to destroy what he created, it's to bring back and to save and to regenerate and even make better. So resurrection is to take the corpse, bring it back to life, not to destroy the corpse, but to return it to life and then transform it into immortality. So we see that he's going to do this. Paul says this in Romans 8, toward the end of the chapter, that all of creation is going to be redeemed. So it's not going to be necessarily destroyed, it's going to be redeemed and made better. So resurrection is part of that. It differs from the ancient Greek belief that the body was just a prison for the soul or the spirit. And so the Greeks look forward to shedding their body so that their spirit would be freed from it. But the Jews and then the Christians thought differently. It's like, no, the body is good, but it's going to be transformed to become even better.
Okay. Thank you, Doctor. We have another question from IIT Kanpur. Where do we gather evidence for the excruciating nature of the crucifixion? That is, the very details of it.
Oh, okay, good. So years ago, there's a little book titled Crucifixion, and it's written by a New Testament scholar named Martin Hengel. And he refers to a whole lot of those texts. And then just last year, let me see if I can, let me grab it off my shelf. I'll show you. Last year, a new book came out. This is definitely going to be the best on it, and very, very helpful. Would be probably just what you're looking for. It's called The Trial and Crucifixion of Jesus. It's a rather thick book. So, and it's not cheap. Let's see, it's over 800 pages long, but it has every text in it, in its original language and the translation, and then comments on it. It's got all of that. So the original text in its original language, and then an English translation, and then a commentary on it that explains it. Every text in antiquity up to that time that discusses crucifixion. So you'll be able to see it. Again, this is the most comprehensive book ever written on it. Just came out, it came out in 2019. The Trial and Crucifixion of Jesus. But if you want just a very short one, and it's not expensive, get one called Crucifixion by Martin Hengel.
Thank you, Dr. Licona. We've got one more question from IIT Hyderabad. How to cancel out the possibility that the disciples had lied about Jesus' resurrection? Yeah, this question was posed twice.
Okay. Well, I think I covered that in my lecture. Insofar as we have numerous reports, even from the first century, even from a non-Christian named Josephus, about Christians who were suffering, the disciples and Jesus' brother, they suffered continuously and were killed. Several of them were killed for their gospel proclamation. So this doesn't prove that their proclamation was true, but it shows that it strongly suggests that they believe that what they were proclaiming is true. You might have one or two people who are willing to just go on with something they know is false. If Jesus didn't rise from the dead, and you had so many messianic movements. Josephus talks about that there were many so-called messiahs in the first century, but the Romans killed them all. And when the Romans killed them, their followers just dispersed. They stopped following the person, and they found another messianic figure, or they just went home. So why would the followers of Jesus be any different? If Jesus was killed by the Romans, they would have believed that Jesus was a false Messiah. And so it seems to me they would have just ceased following him at that point. But instead, they continued to follow him and go out and proclaim his atoning death and resurrection. And it's like, okay, well, if you keep doing this, we're going to throw you in prison. We're going to beat you. We're going to scourge you. We're going to put you to brutal deaths. And they're saying, go ahead and do it because we saw him and we're looking forward to heaven. We have eternal life. So you can destroy our body, but you can't destroy our souls. We're going to be with Christ forever in heaven. And so that strongly suggests that they were not lying and that they had these experiences that they truly interpreted as being appearances of the risen Jesus to them. They truly believed Jesus had been raised from the dead.
Thank you, Dr. Licona. We've got two questions from YouTube. This is centered around Jesus and India. Is there any credence to the theory that Jesus came to Kashmir? The second question goes, is there any written record of the teachings of Saint Thomas, who came to South India in the 1st century?
Okay, so in terms of the first one now, I've heard in the past about Jesus going to India, but I haven't really looked into it. But as far as I know, there are no credible sources that would say that. I mean, it would be an enormous trip, of course, and there's nothing really to suggest that that happened. Of course, it would have happened prior to his ministry at age 30, but I don't see any really good evidence of that happening. In terms of Thomas going to India, I haven't really studied it, but I did hear from someone who had, and they thought that there was some credibility behind that report, but that's all I could really say. I don't know myself because I haven't studied it.
Hello. Okay. Thank you, Dr. Licona. We now have to the end of our program. First of all, we, the ISC Bible Study Forum, would like to thank Dr. Licona for your time and for addressing our questions on the resurrection. We are very glad to have hosted you, Doctor.
Thank you.
We would also like to thank all of you who are here with us and from the institutes that are connected online for joining with us today. For those who are interested, we are a group of IISc students and faculty who study the Bible regularly. We meet up every Tuesday for a common time of Bible study and discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to us, and please do fill in the feedback forms and hand it to our volunteers on your way out. We also have some books and literature for you to browse through. Feel free to collect them on your way out. Once again, thank you, Dr. Licona, and thank you all for joining us today. Have a very good evening.